United Airlines Flight 1175 was supposed to be an uneventful journey, just like countless other flights traveling between the mainland United States and Hawaii. The Boeing 777-222, a twin-engine wide-body aircraft, had taken off from San Francisco International Airport on the morning of February 13, 2018, carrying over 370 passengers and crew. Pilots in the cockpit ran through their routine checks, monitoring fuel levels, navigation systems, and communication with air traffic control. The weather was favorable, with clear skies and no significant turbulence expected along the route. As the aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude of 36,000 feet, passengers settled into their seats, enjoying in-flight entertainment, reading books, or simply looking out over the vast Pacific Ocean below. Many were heading to Honolulu for vacations, family visits, or business trips, unaware that their peaceful flight was about to take a terrifying turn. The crew continued their regular duties, serving drinks and meals, ensuring passengers were comfortable as the aircraft smoothly glided across the open water. For the flight crew, everything appeared routine. The aircraft's systems were functioning as expected, and there were no signs of trouble. However, hidden within one of the plane's massive Pratt & Whitney PW4000 engines was an undetected weakness. A single fan blade had developed cracks due to prolonged stress and wear. These cracks, invisible to the naked eye, were slowly weakening the engine, making it vulnerable to catastrophic failure. Roughly an hour from Honolulu, at the point where the plane was far from the mainland but not yet in sight of Hawaii, disaster struck. Without warning, the right engine suffered a violent failure. A loud explosion echoed through the aircraft, followed by a severe jolt. Passengers sitting near the wing saw pieces of metal break away, some of them striking the fuselage. The outer casing of the engine had completely detached, exposing the rotating components inside. Inside the cabin, panic spread instantly. The calm atmosphere from moments earlier was gone, replaced by gasps and screams. People instinctively gripped their armrests as the aircraft began to shake. The sound of rushing wind filled the cabin as pieces of debris scattered into the sky. Flight attendants, though trained for emergencies, were momentarily taken aback by the sudden chaos before quickly moving to reassure passengers and maintain order. In the cockpit, the pilots immediately recognized the severity of the situation. Engine malfunctions were rare, and in most cases, an aircraft could continue flying safely on a single engine. However, this was no ordinary failure. The engine had essentially torn itself apart, leaving the pilots with limited control and a damaged airframe. Warning alarms filled the cockpit as system indicators flashed, signaling a sudden loss of thrust and the need for emergency action. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the captain and first officer worked quickly to stabilize the aircraft. Their primary goal was to maintain altitude and prevent an uncontrolled descent. With one engine still operational, they had some ability to control the plane, but they would need to act fast to ensure a safe landing. They immediately contacted air traffic control, declaring an emergency and requesting priority clearance to Honolulu. The response was swift. Controllers directed them toward the nearest runway and advised emergency crews to prepare for their arrival. Meanwhile, in the cabin, passengers continued to brace themselves for the unknown. Some sat frozen in fear, gripping their seats, while others quietly whispered prayers or clung to loved ones. A few passengers near the right side of the aircraft could see the exposed engine, its remaining components still spinning despite the damage. The reality of the situation was setting in. Something had gone terribly wrong, and they were now at the mercy of the crew's ability to guide them safely to land. As the aircraft continued toward Honolulu, the pilots had to carefully balance speed, altitude, and stability. Flying on one engine meant reduced power, making it critical to manage the descent with precision. Too fast, and they could struggle to control the landing. Too slow, and they risked losing lift before reaching the airport. Every decision had to be calculated, every adjustment made with complete focus. Despite the terrifying circumstances, the crew remained professional and composed. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, instructing passengers to remain seated, secure their belongings, and prepare for landing. Though fear was evident in their faces, their training allowed them to remain calm, providing reassurance where it was needed most. With Honolulu International Airport now in sight, the pilots knew the most critical part of the flight was ahead. A smooth landing was essential, but they had limited options if anything else went wrong. The exposed engine created additional drag, and strong headwinds made controlling the descent even more challenging. As the aircraft approached the runway, passengers could see emergency vehicles lined up along the tarmac, their lights flashing in anticipation. The cabin fell into near silence as everyone prepared for impact, hoping that the landing would go as planned. For the pilots, there was no room for error. This would be their final test, the moment that would determine whether everyone on board would walk away safely. United Airlines Flight 1175 had started as just another routine journey across the Pacific. Now, it was on the verge of becoming an aviation disaster. But with the crew's skill, quick thinking, and the resilience of modern engineering, the flight was far from over. The question remained, could they bring the aircraft down safely, or would the damage prove too much to overcome? The aircraft shuddered violently as the right engine hung in ruins, its protective covering completely torn away. Debris from the explosion had damaged parts of the wing, and vibrations pulsed through the cabin, making every second a struggle to maintain stability. The noise was deafening. Wind rushed past the exposed engine components, and passengers on the right side had a direct view of the destruction. Fear spread as people realized the severity of the situation. Inside the cockpit, the pilots fought to keep control. The flight instruments reflected the harsh reality: an unbalanced aircraft, reduced thrust, and a compromised aerodynamic structure. Losing an engine was a major emergency, but the destruction of the nacelle, combined with potential wing damage, made their job even more difficult. The autopilot struggled to compensate, forcing the captain to take full manual control. Warnings and alarms filled the cockpit as the aircraft lost some of its efficiency. The pilots knew they had to descend strategically, adjusting their approach to maximize the performance of the remaining engine. They focused on keeping the aircraft level, preventing it from veering dangerously to one side due to the uneven power output. Meanwhile, in the passenger cabin, flight attendants moved quickly to reassure those on board. Despite the tension, they relied on their training, providing clear instructions and doing their best to keep everyone calm. Some passengers gripped their seats, too frightened to speak, while others whispered hurried prayers or comforted loved ones. The uncertainty weighed on everyone, knowing that there were still many miles of open ocean between them and the nearest runway. The aircraft's structure continued to vibrate as it powered forward on one engine. The pilots remained in constant communication with air traffic control, receiving weather updates and clearance for an emergency landing. Ground crews at Honolulu International Airport had already mobilized, preparing for a possible high-risk touchdown. Fire trucks and ambulances lined the runway, waiting for what could become a life-or-death scenario. For the passengers, time seemed to stretch endlessly. Every minute in the air felt like an eternity, each unexpected movement of the aircraft amplifying their fear. Some tried to distract themselves by closing their eyes or gripping armrests, while others watched anxiously as the damaged engine remained exposed to the elements. The pilots continued to make adjustments, carefully monitoring fuel consumption and altitude. The remaining engine had to function perfectly, as any further issues could lead to an even greater crisis. Fortunately, the left engine held strong, keeping them on course despite the challenges. As the aircraft drew closer to Honolulu, air traffic controllers provided the latest wind and weather conditions, advising the crew on the best possible approach. The pilots knew that their final descent had to be executed flawlessly. With the additional drag from the damaged nacelle, they needed to maintain enough speed to stay in control but avoid coming in too fast. Flight attendants walked through the aisles, checking seat belts and reinforcing emergency procedures. The reality of the situation had fully set in. This was not an ordinary landing. Everyone on board braced for impact, aware that even a small miscalculation could turn an already dangerous situation into a catastrophe. The aircraft descended toward the island, passing over the deep blue waters of the Pacific. The outline of the airport became visible, its long runways a welcome sight after what had felt like an endless struggle. The pilots ran through their final checklist, ensuring that the flaps and landing gear were in position despite the turbulence caused by the uneven airflow around the aircraft. Inside the cabin, tension was at its peak. Passengers held onto each other, their eyes locked on the windows as the ground drew closer. The damaged engine remained a chilling reminder of how close they had come to disaster. With the runway ahead, the pilots prepared for one of the most critical moments of their careers. Their goal was clear: land the aircraft safely, keep it stable upon touchdown, and avoid any further structural damage. As they made the final approach, they relied on every ounce of their training and experience to guide them through. The wheels neared the tarmac, and every person on board held their breath, hoping that the aircraft would hold together long enough for them to reach safety. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was no room for error. The Boeing 777 neared the runway, its damaged engine a haunting sight as the pilots prepared for the most critical phase of the flight. The airport's emergency response teams were already in position, lining the tarmac with fire trucks and ambulances, ready for any outcome. The weight of responsibility rested heavily on the crew as they concentrated on executing a safe landing despite the aircraft's compromised state. The descent was turbulent, with strong winds adding to the challenge. With one engine providing all the thrust, the pilots had to carefully balance speed and stability, ensuring the aircraft remained under control. The additional drag from the destroyed engine nacelle made it harder to maintain an even approach, forcing them to make constant adjustments. In the cockpit, hands gripped the controls tightly, scanning the instrument readings and making precise calculations. Every second counted. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was tense. The once steady hum of flight had been replaced by an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional overhead announcement. Passengers braced themselves, gripping armrests, whispering words of reassurance to one another, or closing their eyes in anticipation. Flight attendants took their final walk through the aisles, ensuring that everyone was prepared for impact. Despite their composed demeanor, the reality of the situation weighed on them. This landing would determine whether all 370 souls on board would make it to safety. As the aircraft approached the runway, the pilots focused on making the touchdown as smooth as possible. The remaining engine had to be carefully managed, preventing any abrupt movements that could send the plane off course. The closer they came to the ground, the more critical every adjustment became. The runway lights grew brighter, the thick black lines of the tarmac stretching ahead like a lifeline amid the uncertainty. Then, in a moment that felt both instantaneous and stretched beyond time, the landing gear made contact with the ground. A jolt ran through the aircraft as the tires gripped the runway, sending vibrations through the cabin. The pilots immediately engaged the braking systems, relying on the aircraft's design to slow it down efficiently. Without the second engine to assist with reverse thrust, they had to depend entirely on mechanical braking and aerodynamic drag. Smoke billowed from the tires as the aircraft decelerated, the sound of screeching rubber filling the cabin. The pressure inside the cockpit was immense, but the pilots maintained control, ensuring the aircraft stayed centered on the runway. Every eye inside the plane was fixed forward, waiting for the final, crucial moment when the aircraft would come to a full stop. After what felt like an eternity, the plane slowed to a safe speed, rolling toward the designated emergency stop area. A wave of relief swept through the cabin, but no one moved just yet. The uncertainty still lingered, and passengers waited for instructions from the crew. Fire trucks surrounded the aircraft within seconds, emergency personnel scanning for any signs of further damage or potential fire. Inside the cockpit, the pilots completed their shutdown procedures, exchanging a glance that spoke volumes. They had done it. Against all odds, they had brought the aircraft down safely, ensuring that every person on board survived an emergency that could have ended in catastrophe. The cabin crew sprang into action, preparing for possible evacuation. Though the plane had landed intact, they needed to be sure there were no immediate dangers before allowing passengers to disembark. The sound of the captain's voice came over the intercom, informing everyone that they had safely landed in Honolulu and that emergency teams were conducting final checks. The weight of those words finally allowed passengers to exhale, some breaking into quiet tears, others clinging to loved ones in gratitude. Minutes later, with clearance from the ground crews, the cabin doors were opened. Passengers filed out cautiously, stepping onto the tarmac where they were greeted by emergency responders. Some looked back at the aircraft, its wounded right engine a stark reminder of what they had just endured. The once powerful machine had carried them across the Pacific, even in its broken state, and had delivered them safely to solid ground. For the crew, there was no immediate celebration. Their training had guided them through the ordeal, but the adrenaline was still wearing off. As they stepped off the aircraft, they were met with handshakes and quiet words of appreciation from emergency personnel. Though they had remained composed throughout, the reality of how close they had come to disaster would take time to fully sink in. Investigators wasted no time examining the aircraft, searching for the root cause of the engine failure. Preliminary inspections quickly pointed to a fractured fan blade, a finding that would later prompt increased safety measures across the aviation industry. Airlines operating similar Boeing 777 models were ordered to conduct thorough engine inspections to prevent another occurrence. For the passengers, Flight 1175 would forever remain a defining moment in their lives. Some vowed never to take flying for granted again, while others reflected on the sheer professionalism that had brought them safely to land. The flight crew's calm under pressure, the pilot's skill in handling the emergency, and the aircraft's resilience had all played a role in preventing what could have been a disaster. In the weeks that followed, aviation authorities worked closely with Boeing and airline operators to ensure that similar failures would not happen again. The incident served as a reminder that even the most advanced machines required constant vigilance and that the people operating them had to be prepared for any scenario. United Airlines Flight 1175 had faced a terrifying ordeal, but through expert piloting, teamwork, and a bit of luck, it had become a story of survival rather than tragedy. The memory of that flight, the sound of the explosion, the trembling cabin, and the sight of the exposed engine would stay with those on board forever. But above all, it was a reminder of the resilience of modern aviation and the dedication of those who work every day to ensure that passengers arrive safely at their destinations. As passengers stepped onto solid ground, the relief was overwhelming. Some looked back at the aircraft, its right engine severely damaged, a stark reminder of how close they had come to disaster. Others simply held onto their loved ones, still processing the terrifying moments they had endured. The tension that had gripped the cabin for the past hour slowly faded, replaced by gratitude that they had made it safely to land. The flight attendants, who had maintained composure throughout the ordeal, exchanged quiet glances, acknowledging the magnitude of what they had just experienced. For the pilots, there was no immediate celebration. The adrenaline that had carried them through the emergency was wearing off, replaced by the sheer exhaustion of having navigated one of the most challenging situations of their careers. Their training had prepared them for this, but the reality of seeing an engine disintegrate mid-flight, feeling the aircraft shake violently over the open ocean, and knowing they had hundreds of lives depending on their decisions had taken a toll. Still, they had done what they were trained to do, brought everyone home safely. Outside, emergency crews worked quickly to assess the aircraft, scanning for any structural damage beyond what was already visible. Investigators had already begun documenting the failure, knowing that this incident would lead to new discussions about aircraft safety. Boeing representatives arrived on site to examine the engine, eager to understand exactly what had gone wrong. While initial reports pointed to metal fatigue in one of the fan blades, a full analysis would take time. Airline officials met with passengers, offering assistance and ensuring that those shaken by the experience received proper support. Some travelers immediately called family members, voices trembling as they recounted what had happened. Others remained silent, still absorbing the reality of how close they had come to tragedy. The mood was somber, yet filled with a quiet appreciation for the expertise that had saved them. As the investigation unfolded, the aviation industry took notice. The failure of the Pratt & Whitney engine was not the first of its kind, but the severity of the incident placed renewed focus on inspections and maintenance protocols. Airlines operating similar aircraft conducted urgent checks to prevent a similar malfunction. Regulators demanded stricter oversight, ensuring that no engine with potential vulnerabilities remained in service. Safety teams worked to implement new guidelines, emphasizing the importance of early detection of wear and tear. Boeing, already under scrutiny for past mechanical issues, faced pressure to explain how such a catastrophic failure had occurred. Engineers examined the fractured blade, searching for weaknesses that could have been caught sooner. Though the aircraft had ultimately landed safely, the event highlighted the fine line between routine operations and unexpected emergencies. It was a stark reminder that even the most advanced aviation technology required constant vigilance. For the passengers of Flight 1175, the experience left a lasting impression. Some swore they would never fly again, the fear of reliving those moments too overwhelming. Others, though deeply affected, found solace in knowing that air travel remained one of the safest modes of transportation. Many expressed gratitude not just for the skill of the pilots, but for the teamwork that had kept the situation from spiraling further out of control. The professionalism of the crew, the swift response from air traffic control, and the resilience of the aircraft itself had all played a role in ensuring a safe outcome. United Airlines reassured travelers that safety remained their highest priority. Statements were released detailing enhanced inspections, increased monitoring of critical components, and commitments to continuous improvement. While the company had handled the emergency with precision, the airline industry as a whole knew that passengers needed more than words to restore confidence. Transparency and action would be key in ensuring trust was not lost. Months later, the results of the investigation confirmed what experts had suspected. The fan blade had developed microscopic cracks over time, weakening until it finally failed. The breakdown was a warning, not just for Boeing or United Airlines, but for the entire industry. Engine manufacturers and airlines alike took note, increasing inspections and refining maintenance schedules to prevent future occurrences. Despite the crisis, Flight 1175 would not be remembered as a tragedy. Instead, it became a story of survival, a testament to the expertise and preparedness of those who work behind the scenes to make flying as safe as possible. It was a reminder of the importance of rigorous safety standards and the necessity of constant vigilance in an industry where even the smallest oversight could have devastating consequences. For the crew, the experience reinforced why they had chosen their careers. They had been tested in the most extreme conditions, forced to rely on instinct, skill, and years of training to ensure that their passengers landed safely. They knew that emergencies could happen at any time, but they also understood the power of preparation. Their ability to stay calm under pressure had made all the difference. As time passed, passengers returned to their routines, some stepping onto new flights with a deeper appreciation for the unseen efforts that go into every journey. Others chose alternative ways to travel, unable to shake the fear that had gripped them on that day. But no one who had been on that flight would ever forget what it felt like to hear an engine explode midair, to see metal debris peeling away, to wonder if they would ever see the ground again. The lessons from United Airlines Flight 1175 echoed throughout the aviation industry, prompting changes that would enhance safety for future travelers. It was a close call, one that served as a wake-up call, but, thankfully, not a catastrophe. In the end, the flight that had started as an ordinary journey across the Pacific became an extraordinary testament to human resilience, technical skill, and the unyielding commitment to keeping the skies safe.